Hello, this is a summary of my first week of streaming where I was coding stuff and in general doing stuff that didn't include gaming for the most part. You can treat this as a kind of devlog, but it's more of a summary of what I was just crafting on stream. This is a very spontaneous recording. I'm still finding my footing here, and we'll see how it will go as weeks pass. For now, let's keep this in this awkward style and let's just talk what I was doing for the last week. Also, my Twitch stream is in the description. You can check it out. I stream every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 15 of Central European time, as well as on Saturdays a bit later, somewhere around 19 or 20. No, I won't be using this AM PM format. I prefer these 24 hours. So the day one began with setting the usual stuff. Whenever I create a new project, I just reuse a template I've made for myself. This template includes the folder structure, you can see how it looks like. Setting the bootstrap. The bootstrap is already prepared, all I have to do is hook up the scenes in the scene list. And finally setting the backend to IL to CPP. Because even if this game will be for PC, it's still nice to have this kind of thing set up. So a quick note on how Bootstrap works. A bootstrap is the first scene we load. The purpose of this scene is to initialize all our systems we have set, all the singletons, all the managers, in general all the mission critical systems. Then after it's done loading and initializing, we then automatically load whatever scene we have set. By default it loads the main menu, however we can set it to load whatever we want. Once the technicalities have been set, the time came for deciding what we'll be doing actually. I decided on making a corridor-based shooter with some eventual plans for some stealth mechanics. A very simple project in general, though it fits because my goal is not to make an actual game, my goal is to have a playground for testing sound design and other things. Despite this being a dummy project, in general, you should always have some plan for the architecture. Because with good architecture, not only maintaining stuff is easier, in general, the process is faster. So after pondering about various kind of systems for a while, I decided on this one. This is a pretty lazy setup. This basically is just do whatever you want. You just have an event bus for communicating all the systems. They're not like tightly coupled with each other, as well as having a game manager, which is simply the parent singleton that has all the switches for everything. So, since game manager and event bus are the only like static, definite things in this architecture, I proceed to quickly define them. For the event bus, I borrowed the design made by GitAmend. By the way, this channel is like amazing if you want a lot of architecture and the Unity tech stuff that is actually decent level and has no bullshit. This channel is just pure gold. However, before doing the game manager, I sat on this event bus for quite a while, analyzing how does it work. It took about like half an hour or more. Anyway, when I finally came to write the game manager, I just wrote a simple bare bones thing that just has a enum for the state of the game. This could be later used for just turning off stuff, but for now this doesn't do much. Then I began to code the player. And before I even coded the simple player controller, I realized one thing. Because I wanted the player to be a state machine, by the principle of dry, I realized that I should make this a general thing, since a state machine would be later used for stuff like enemies and potentially other systems. That's a good moment to talk about AI in the process of coding, because for this project I wanted to mainly code all the things by myself, only just asking ChatGPT or Copilot for additional things if I wanted to. But for this case, I needed to rely a bit more heavily, because I didn't have the idea how to make a state machine for which I don't have to code every single transition between every single state if most of those transitions will be simply generic or even just not used. After doing some things with ChatGPT, it suggested quite a good solution. By the way, GPT-5 is really good in this manner. I remember when I worked with GPT-4, I had to guide it pretty heavily. And when GPT-5 suggested this structure for state machine, I was quite shocked because it was quite a good design, in my opinion. I'm not an advanced coder, I'm still kind of beginner, but holy shit. Anyway, so the way the player works looks like that. Player is a game object, it's a prefab, and it contains this player controller mono behavior, which is the main orchestrator of everything that happens to the player in terms of like player related logic. All the stuff like health or in general stuff that is common in the game, not tied to just the player, will be simply moved to other components. A player controller contains a state machine as well as a player context, a special class that contains information that will be used by the state machine. The state machine by default doesn't have any notion of time. It needs to be passed manually and it's supplied by the player controller, which has the direct access to the engine time. Or at least that's the bare thing I made on day one. Later, more stuff will be added to it. After doing just that, I went for a break. After testing bilateral PvP with my friend for an hour, I got back and immediately got sidetracked to work on a level manager. For what? I don't know. But I got the chance to write some really weird spaghetti for that. Look at those exceptions. Ugh. After being done with that, I moved on to something much more important, which is input. I've made some quick input actions, and then I hooked them up in a input manager. Why not inside the player controller? Well, the input manager could be a better idea in case you have a scene without the player, like situations when you have mini games or in general menus. After setting a very bare bones input manager, I stopped doing anything that day, and that's the day one. I began day two with explaining what I did in between streams. Not much, just adding enable and disable methods to input manager, as well as getting some footing in the state machine by coding some simple off state. The first thing I began to do was to make some test platform for movement in ProBuilder, but I quickly surrendered. I then began to code the main state starting with movement. For movement, I've decided on the simple stream-like system where we read input, we then transform it in some way, and finally pass it to character controller, which we use for moving the player. For camera movement, I've done something else. I decoupled the camera from the player to allow for more control for things like cutscenes or maybe just simply locking vision for anything. The way this works is that the camera we use has its own camera controller component, and this camera is then assigned to the player controller, which passes this camera to the player context, which allows for using this camera directly in the state machine. The rest is very similar with the input. We pass the input directly into the camera controller, which then processes the thing and moves the camera. Alongside coding the basic planar motion, forward, backward, left, rightward, I also added the input actions for jumping, running, and crouching, and then implemented them in the main state. For crouching is for now without any camera descent. And I also implemented a helper class, which would allow me to read the vector to input into a vector-free motion vector. When I finally went to test the movement, I got an error, something related to the level manager. Curious. This error took me extremely long to fix, if you call almost an hour on stream extremely long, mainly because I was stubborn and I didn't want to do a simple spaghetti-like fix, which in the end worked. Still, it took so long, I began to design the system for weapons. When I fixed the error, I also had to fix a bunch of minor logic errors, but these were fast and quick to fix. And finally, it worked. Somewhat, I had to tweak some stuff a bit, but in the end, it turned out to be serviceable. In terms of the weapon system, I was coding snippets of stuff in between fixing the errors as well as after the testing. And what I ultimately got is this kind of mechanism. I added a special class weapon handler which would handle all the weapon logic, at least in principle. Later it would turn out, especially on day 3, that a lot of logic that should be in the weapon handler I coded it in the main state. Nonetheless, this class lives in the player context and it can be accessed this way in the state. Alongside the weapon handler, I also introduced a class for the weapons. For the weapons, I decided them to be pure MVC objects. That is, a weapon is just an abstract thing living somewhere in this virtual space of memory. It is only displayed via a model, yet to be introduced, as well as it gets all its data from some separate object that has all the stuff defined. Besides just coding these structures, I also thought about how to implement various kinds of weapons that had support for them, because it would be kind of boring to have just same mechanism for everything, especially that we'll be playing with sound design later, and the more technical opportunities you have, the more interesting things you can create. So the first design choice was to make every weapon a burst weapon. What do I mean by that? Technically, you can model the shooting of any weapon like that. When you press the input, you begin a sequence. This sequence, by default, has a delay after it. Technically, when you are shooting a single fire weapon, when you're shooting, press a delay, then you can shoot again, and so on. For automatic weapons, you can simply allow for holding. Now, technically, this sequence holds a series of smaller sequences, which will be the burst. This means if I want to have a burst of 3 bullets, then in this sequence, I insert 3 bullets delayed by their own delay, and then after the sequence ends, we add the additional time. So even if most weapons won't be burst in practice, technically they all simply have just 1 bullet in their burst series. For the second design choice, I decided for the weapons to have deterministic recoil. That is, instead of randomizing the recoil or having just a uniform recoil, every shot for a weapon could be programmed to have a specific direction. Games like Apex Legends do that. You can literally go to a firing range in those games, turn on the holes, and look for the pattern. So at this retrospective point, the burst is yet to be implemented. The recoil is simply just an array of vector 2s, so that's not a big problem. But the actual problem is the firing itself. I implemented some input actions for firing and left that as it is. I'll be taking care of this on day 3. So day 3 I can summarize quickly as doing nothing. That is, I was constantly remaking and thinking over how I want to implement stuff and kind of going in circles. So one thing I did for certain was that I added the input actions that I made 2 days earlier and implemented them in the input manager. Now, these actions were implemented as normal C# events, not the events from the event bus. Why? Probably because I didn't see the reason for that, but we'll see, maybe I'll refactor this later. Nonetheless, after setting the actions, I spent the vast majority of the stream sitting in these 5 methods. The enter and exit methods, which are called whenever you enter or exit the state, the handle fire method, which is called every frame. This is run in subupdate, which itself is run in the update of the player controller. The choose method, which is called whenever a player changes their weapon. And finally, the burst coroutine, which was the implementation of actually shooting. There was also this sixth method, shoot, but now it's somewhere else. And I also didn't do much in it. And so most of the struggle today was to handle the inputs properly, handle all the flags, handle the burst coroutine properly, which we'll talk in a moment. But otherwise, these days worth more glossing over rather than getting into details. So let's talk about the burst coroutine. The problem with it was not in the logic itself, it was in what kind of method is this? What I wanted it to be is that I wanted it to be a coroutine, something that runs parallel, something that waits some time and does stuff. So the natural choice was to make it an enumerator, which in Unity can be run using start coroutine. There's this one problem, however. Start coroutine is a method accessible only in mono behaviors. And while the state machine does technically run in a mono behavior, it doesn't inherit from a mono behavior, and so it cannot use the start coroutine. So instead, I decided to move to async await, and with some slight AI help to make a task out of it. But this has another problem, because tasks use system milliseconds. They don't use the scaled time the engine has. And this could be a problem if we ever wanted to mess with the time, as well as simply having any coherency with in general events in the engine. The solution was to make something called a coroutine runner. The coroutine runner is a singleton which takes in tasks and kind of turns them into coroutines. It's kind of difficult to explain it in like plain words, but the overall idea is to be able to use the await async syntax while still having the scaled time of the engine. Yet Amanda has something very similar on his channel, and not gonna lie, this is a really interesting hack, as he put it. Nonetheless, with all this logic, that's how I ended the day, just having some semi-working code, not yet implemented to actually work, and definitely not yet tested, and also requiring some good refactoring. So that day I only additionally coded a quick health component and called it done. So day 4 was meant not for coding, but for instead doing some sound design. And so the only thing I mentioned about code on this day was just the fact that I refactored the weapon code. And so now most of the logic properly relies either in the weapon or weapon handler class, and the main state only reads input and those input related stuff. So the rest of the day I spent rummaging through my trash boxes, hitting random things against each other, hitting some boxes, playing with my little microphone, and then doing some weird sound effect, which was supposed to sound like a gun, but listen for yourself. It sounds a bit closer to a gun, but at the end of the day, I was showing some music presets, some I shouldn't, since Labs Plus is a subscription service, and my subscription is long expired. So for private use, I might play with this, but not on stream? But I don't know. So that was the summary of the first week. Do I have any reflections? I should work on editing earlier. I crunched the entire Sunday and I'm completely worn out. It's currently 13:45. I have an hour to prepare for the next stream, and have to release this summary because it would kind of suck to release it after a stream. So yeah, see ya.